So these 5 painting techniques are going to focus on the interaction of paint in the surface or the colors underneath. Glazing is a way of using semi-transparent or translucent colors over top of a color to create those color mixtures. So while this may look green and orange, it's actually lightened layers of blue and red over top of the yellow. Glazing is really great for creating layered effects by stacking colors of paint over top existing colors, and this is what most Renaissance paintings were done using. That way they could create those skin tones by creating many layers of color. Gloss medium focuses on changing the sheen or how shiny or dull a surface is. So while paint typically dries in matte or satin, meaning it's not very reflective, we can use gloss medium to make it reflect or make it stand out, creating an altered sheen or reflectivity. Staining simply just uses the pigment and tries to leave it on the paper. This was applied with a paper towel. This allows the background to have different subtle color textures. Dry brushing tries to focus on the use of a dry, flat brush to create areas where the paint breaks up and creates texture, which is really good for recreating things like wood or other surfaces. And Scumbling focuses on using a dry brush technique, typically with a round brush, to allow the background color to show through, kind of a layering effect. We will discuss how to create all 5 of these techniques before you try to create your own sample painting using them. So for glazing, you're going to be creating thin, semi-transparent layers of one color over another to slightly change that color of the paint underneath. So for this example, we're going to start with yellow as an underbase, and we're going to layer blue and red over top of it. When blue is layered over the yellow, it should create kind of a greenish hue, and whenever red is layered over the yellow, using our color theory knowledge, it should make almost an orangish hue. To do this, you're going to need water to thin the paint down or matte medium. We want to dilute it down. So we're just going to start with the blue, and blue tends to be an opaque color. And one of the things you're going to find out about color is some colors are more transparent than others. Yellow, orange, red, those warmer colors tend to be pretty transparent, whereas things like blues and purples tend to be very opaque or solid. So I'm going to lay a little bit of blue down on my palette. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin this down. For the blue, I'm going to thin it down with some water. So I'm going to add water in there to dilute my mixture. And what that's going to do is make it more transparent. Those pigment particles are becoming farther apart. So I'm just going to go through, and then I'm going to paint over top. And I'm going to make this a thin layer. Now what you'll notice is that the paint on my area is not as blue as the actual paint on my palette, that it's almost creating a green hue on here as you paint it. We'll let that dry. So glazing is a way of stacking colors. For the red, I'm going to use some matte medium, so something that's a little bit more like the acrylic glue. So you're going to want to mix these colors on your palette, so I'm going to move some more red onto my palette over here, and I'm going to grab some matte medium. When I grab that matte medium, I'm going to use it to dilute down my mixture. Clean my brush to get some of that matte medium. And I'm just going to add a little bit into this to help thin it down. The matte medium also works as a glazing agent. So I'll be able to go over and add some of that in to create thin layers over top. Sometimes if your color is already transparent, it will help. So what we're seeing here is how the color over top can be layered over. And it will allow the color from the underneath to influence it. So let's just look at what red looks like underneath this. I'm going to use a nice wide flat brush to show this. So rather than looking red, that looks somewhat orange, almost pink. So we want to allow our glazing to have those colors interact, either using water or matte medium. Now gloss medium is a cool effect that we can get to make one part of our painting shiny and reflective and leave the back matte or kind of dull. So we're changing what we call the sheen or the reflectivity of our painting. Typically paints tend to be kind of matte or satin, which means they're not very reflective. But gloss medium, labeled GM in your kit, is something that allows a lot more light to reflect. This can be used on eyeballs if you want them to pop and seem glossy or wet. It can also be used in other areas to create secret or hidden images in the back. It's really quite basic. We're not really mixing any colors in with this. We're doing almost a glazing-like technique without any pigment. And we're just going to paint something over top. So for this, I'm just going to go in and paint a star. Now the challenge with using gloss medium is that wherever you paint, it will stay. That sheen will be changed. We can try to go back over it with paint, but typically you want to have a good plan in place, because once you alter that sheen and smooth that out, it's going to be hard to change it. Now this will dry clear and reflective, but I would suggest trying to work any of your brush strokes out. Using a flat brush would help, but a round brush will work as long as you go over the areas and slowly smooth it out. Those ridges will show up as texture. So we're going to paint this, and then once it dries, you'll be able to see the reflective nature of it and how it contrasts with the matte or satin background. Just the subtle staining effect, you're only going to need a few simple materials: a paper towel or some sort of cloth to transfer your paint, a basic painting surface, usually white or a bold color, and some paint and water to water down the paint. To create a stained surface, what you're going to want to do is create a really watery mixture, almost like if you were glazing. So for this, I'm going to take my red and I'm going to add a lot of water to it. I want it to have a lot of flow to it. I don't want it to have its really thick qualities of the paint as it came out of the tube or the cup. And what I'm going to be able to do is just simply take my paper towel, and typically I will wet it a little bit by either painting on top of it as well. And I'm going to pick up some of the paint and simply press. And what we are doing is we are making a very subtle layer of this, but it is stained. This is using the pigment rather than the binder really to affect the surface. If you want, you can always go back in with a little bit more water, hold your paper towel down and soak up some of that to dilute it down even more. So staining can be really cool for subtle background changes where you don't want your color to be too maxed out. So sometimes I'll even use the texture of the paper towel for that. So staining, a little bit of water, a little bit of pigment, and then we're creating subtle values on our backgrounds. Dry brushing is a really great way to get subtle texture, almost like a wood or a worn area. For this, you really want to have a dry brush, something that has not touched any water. For this, I tend to use flat brushes or ones with cornered edges. What dry brushing does is it allows the bristles to spread out without water smoothing it out, leaving behind the texture or the gaps. You'll also want a paper towel to help control how much paint you use. For this, we want to use our palette and try to just pick up a little bit of wet paint and then return to add it. That gives us more control over the moisture. However, if you do need to go and dip into your paint, you want to make sure you have a surface where you can remove some of that. So I'll tend to dip my brush. It's nice and wet right now, so it's going to smooth out. I don't want something like that. So to get a dry brush technique, I need to remove some of that paint and dry the brush out. And I'll do that by doing short strokes on my canvas or on a surface around it. And you'll notice by doing that, that allows us to break it up. Now you can go back into areas where you've had paint and use some of that to create this texture. So dry brushing, using a brush with minimal water, a little bit of paint, and trying to get the texture from the brush itself. Scumbling is kind of like an advanced dry brush technique. It's where you're kind of scrubbing that paint into the painting surface. This is something that was used a lot by Impressionists in that, to get broken areas of color, or areas where the color underneath allows the color over top to interact. So it's a lot similar to sgraffito, but you're using that dry brush, those gaps in your brush strokes, to allow the background color to show through. A great example of this may be doing something like clouds. And for this, I'm going to use a round brush. I'm going to try to dry it off as best I can. Remember, with any dry brush or scumble technique, you don't need a lot of water. I'm going to use white on the blue because I want the blue to show through the white. So I'm going to take a little bit of white. I'm going to paint it off using those short strokes on my paper towel. I'm going to come in and I'm just going to kind of scrub and use small circular motions to create kind of a cloud form. Now what this is allowing it to do is it's allowing that color in the background to show through. And notice that I'm doing these kind of arc shapes. Scumbling relies on those changes. Now this can be very hard on your brush, so you want to make sure you really clean it out and reshape it at the end. So I'm coming in and I'm using that color underneath. So Scumbling always relies on a background color. I'm just kind of scrubbing or scratching that paint into the surface to create these wispy areas. And if you want areas to change value, maybe I want my bottom to be more light, you just layer. So I'm going in, I'm creating a layer, and then I'm working it out later. So Scumbling, using a dry brush technique, typically with a round brush, arc motions to let that color show through the